Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Miscoe. I'm a healthcare lawyer and also a forensic coding expert. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Modifier 59 because this creates a lot of problems for providers in post-payment review. And fundamentally, it's a pretty simplistic modifier to understand when you read it. However, we're going to discuss it. There's a technical definition of this modifier, and then there's a practical definition that you need to be aware of so that you can minimize or mitigate post-payment risk associated with use of this modifier. Fundamentally, the modifier is defined as a distinct procedural service, and CPT goes on to indicate that under certain circumstances, a physician may need to indicate that a procedure or service was distinct or independent from another procedure or service performed on the same day. So fundamentally, for the modifier to be required or to even be relevant, we have to be talking about two services, and one of those services is usually considered to be part of the other service, which means is a nifty way of saying that one service bundles into another service most of the time. However, in certain circumstances, it's appropriate to report those two services separately. And the most common example of this is chiropractic spinal manipulation and manual therapy. And some payers even extend this rule to extremity manipulation as well. And the basis of this bundling relationship is not found in CPT because there's no question that manipulation of the spine for alleviation of neurophysiologic joint dysfunction and all the pre, inter, and post-service work that's associated with the CMT is very, very different in most cases from manual therapy, which is a non-physician practitioner service. It does not include any inherent pre and post-service E&M work, evaluation management work, and it involves services that prior to 1995 had a bunch of different codes. For example, soft tissue mobilization was separately coded, joint mobilization was separately coded, manual traction was separately coded. It also includes things like lymphatic drainage, and interestingly enough, it also includes manipulation, where manipulation is performed by a non-physician practitioner, as opposed to a chiropractor for neurophysiologic joint dysfunction, or that's why chiropractors usually perform manipulation, or the osteopathic manipulative techniques, which are performed to alleviate somatic dysfunction. That inclusion of manipulation notwithstanding, there are some technical circumstances when you really look at the definition of Modifier 59, the expanded definition, and it focuses on concepts like separate anatomic site, separate lesion, and those are the big ones, or separate condition, of course. And certainly, a chiropractor, it is not uncommon for a chiropractor to diagnose subluxation of the spine, for which they perform manipulation, and then also identify other conditions in the soft tissues that are near the spine, such as hypertonicity, your various itises, opathies, and syndromes that you might perform manual therapy services, which might include manual traction of the soft tissues, soft tissue mobilization techniques like trigger point therapy and things of that nature. And under the basic definition, the technical definition of Modifier 59, the manipulation is performed for one condition in one anatomic site. The manual therapy is performed for a separate and distinct ICD-10 diagnosable condition in a separate anatomic location, and therefore you would think that you could unbundle those services, provided that your documentation substantiated that the manual therapy had a separate and distinct therapeutic purpose from the manipulation and wasn't performed simply to prepare the patient for manipulation. Now, technically, that's as true gets. And if you really dig into the definition of separate anatomic location, you get into issues where the two sites are in the same organ system. They can't be contiguous, and I won't bore you with the hyper-technical analysis of what that means and how it applies, but suffice it to say that technically you should be able to separately report manual therapy, CPT 97140, from a manipulation billed under a CMT code 98940 through 98942, when the service absolutely was soft tissue mobilization for a separately diagnosed condition. Now, when you get into manual traction of joints and of or mobilization of joints, and there is a technical difference between mobilization and manipulation, and those joints are in the same vertebral region as the joint you're manipulating. So say you did a technical manipulation of C5 and you traction C6 and C7, and you did a mobilization of the atlas. In that circumstance, I don't think we can substantiate the separate anatomic site or the separate condition, because dysfunction isn't resolved down to the specific segmental level, so we can't diagnose that as separate conditions. And in that circumstance, the bundling would appear technically appropriate. But then there's the practical rule, and I call it the zip code rule. Most payers, when you're talking about this specific code pair, look at whether the manual therapy technique, regardless of what it was, they don't even delineate or seem to understand that manual therapy can be a variety of different things, is performed in the same body area as the manipulation, which means, for example, if you did manipulation in the cervical spine and you did trigger point work in the muscles up around the neck, I'll say the upper mid trapezius and whatever else is out there, deltoids, rhomboids, I don't know. I didn't go to doctor school, so don't laugh at me. Then they would say, well, those are in the same area or the same body area as the manipulation was performed, and therefore they want to bundle it. And if they're relying on the National Correct Coding Initiative, appropriately or not, that isn't the technical result that you get. Or if they've drafted their own policies and they incorporate Modifier 59, they create a conflict, because the Modifier 59 analysis, as it's defined in CPT, which is standard for all covered entities under HIPAA, that creates a conflict with a policy definition that relies on 59, but attempts to redefine it without actually redefining, because it cannot redefine the modifier, because its description is standard in the HIPAA mandated code set. So there's this conflict. So from a risk perspective, you have to know that if you're performing anything, most specifically a manipulation and manual therapy, and you're trying to get separate payment for the manual therapy by putting a 59 modifier, payers audit that code pairing and the use of that modifier very severely. So you're going to make yourself an audit target. Whether we win or not really isn't relevant. I mean, the process is costly enough, in which case, to the extent that you can, you need to identify treatment alternatives that don't put you into a situation where you're billing a code pair where there's a bundling relationship. Some other common problems with Modifier 59 is that people use it when they don't need it. Rather than investigate under the payer-specific rules whether they have established any bundling relationships or they've incorporated the Correct Coding Initiative bundling rules, providers just tend to throw modifiers on everything in the just in case they need a modifier, and that is a really dangerous approach, because, for example, let's say you were doing something simple like a manipulation, spinal manipulation, electric stimulation, and you decide to put a 59 modifier on your electrical stimulation code. Well, there is virtually no CCI edit that would require a Modifier 59 on CPT 97014. Unless you were doing it in conjunction with attended manually applied electric stimulation, which is very unusual. So in that circumstance, Modifier 59 isn't required, and when you report it, you stand out like a sore thumb, because you're the only guy or gal billing 97014 with Modifier 59. So you're an outlier. you're also an outlier as far as the number of procedures that you bill with Modifier 59. So, it's a great way to get a lot of attention. I comically tell providers, you would get less attention from a payer SIU investigator if you went to their office and set their desk on fire and left your card. They tend to audit this 59 modifier issue quite severely. And, let's face it, they got more money than you do. They can, they control the process, and their beliefs regarding the modifier, whether accurate or not, just aren't, and whether supported by medical policy or not, simply aren't going to change. So from that perspective, you need to be especially cautious. Some code pairs that implicate Modifier 59, we mentioned CMT and manual therapy. Little known is CMT and neuromuscular reeducation, which is often miscoded. That code is CPT 97112. It has the same bundling relationship with CMT. So a lot of times people, miscode massage services or manual therapy services as neuromuscular reed, thinking that they're bypassing the bundling issue. Well, you're not. Some other issues, if you're doing manual therapy in conjunction with therapeutic activities, 97530. There's an exclusionary relationship between those two services, but it can be bypassed with Modifier 59, but you need to understand the circumstances. Another one, if you're paying attention to the focus on direct one-on-one contact procedures, where payers are auditing very heavily whether actual one-on-one contact was provided, and was it provided by an appropriately skilled physician or therapist, bypassing the delegation issue for a minute. If you're sensitive to that issue and you're very carefully tracking which services or which exercises you're performing one-on-one, which ones are performed with constant attendance or in a group, and you're billing, one-on-one codes like 97110 and 97530, in addition to group 97150, understand that the one-on-one contact procedures bundle into the group code unless you can demonstrate through your documentation that they were performed separately in time. For example, I did therapeutic exercises one-on-one with a patient from 9 o'clock to 9:15. Then the patient was in a group from 9:15 to 9:30 doing something else. And then they were one-on-one for therapeutic activities from 9:30 to 9:45. I could bill a unit of 97110 for that one-on-one 15 minutes, one unit of 530 for that unit of 15 minutes, and the group code for the remaining 15 minutes. But the interesting thing is the 110 and the 530 need a 59 modifier, and it doesn't mean that they were performed at a separate anatomic site or any of that. It means that they were performed separately in time from the group procedure, and that you weren't co-performing one-on-one and group during the same time period. Similarly, you find some relationships with some of the time-based constant attendance modalities where if you're performing them concurrently, you can't bill them separately, even with a Modifier 59. Other times people misuse Modifier 59 is, especially with time-based codes, they'll bill an exercise for 8 minutes, and then on a separate line, they'll bill a separate exercise under the same code for another 8 minutes with a 59 modifier. That's improper reporting. It's really identifiable. And what you really did is 16 minutes of, say, 97110, even assuming it was one-on-one, and you should have only billed one unit. So those are some circumstances where the use of Modifier 59 can get you in trouble. So you need to check, make sure that you understand when you potentially need it, what the modifier means, and make sure your documentation supports it. And don't forget to check payer policies and check with your colleagues to see who's been audited on that issue and what the payer's position is, and maybe consider either altering the services provided to avoid those issues where you might need to report the modifier, or make sure your documentation is exquisitely clear as to why you're using the modifier. That's all we have time for today. I'm sorry this went just a little bit long, but it's kind of a complex issue. I do want to remind you before we say goodbye for this afternoon to tune in next week to hear Dr. Jerry Klum. I'm sure he's going to have a topic that's equally or more fascinating, and you don't want to miss it. Thanks for your attention today, and we'll see you next time.